West of Arkham, where the hills rise wild and the valleys are choked with deep, impenetrable woods that no axe has ever dared to thin, there lies a region that the locals avoid with a superstitious persistence. It is a land of dark, narrow glens and rocky outcrops, where the very trees seem to lean at angles suggestive of a malevolent intent, and where the thin rivulets of water trickle through the shadows with a sound that is less like a brook and more like a low, rhythmic chanting. In this desolate expanse, there is a particular spot that represents the nadir of this atmospheric gloom, a 5-acre stretch of grey, powdery desolation known to the few who speak of it as the blasted heath. Here nothing grows, and the very soil seems to have been purged of the capacity for life, leaving behind only a fine, acrid dust that never settles, even when the wind is still. The story of this place, and the reason for the impending inundation of the valley by the waters of a new reservoir, is one of cosmic horror and the fragility of the human condition when confronted with the vast, uncaring mysteries of the outer universe. It is a tale pieced together by a surveyor from Boston, a man of practical mind and scientific leanings, who found himself drawn into the orbit of an old broken man named Ammi Pierce. Ammi, who lived in a ramshackle house on the edge of the blighted territory, was the only soul left who remembered the strange days of 1882, and it was through his hesitant, fear-stricken recollections that the history of the Gardner family and the thing that fell from the stars was finally revealed. The nightmare began in June of 1882, following a spectacular meteor shower that had the astronomers at Miskatonic University in a state of high excitement. One particular stone, larger than the rest, had plummeted into the farmstead of Nahum Gardner, a hard-working and respected man who lived with his wife, Nabby, and their 3 sons, Thaddeus, Merwin, and Zenas. The meteorite struck near the family well, burying itself deep in the soft earth. When Nahum first discovered it, the rock was still glowing with a heat that defied the cooling influence of the night air. It was a misshapen, brownish-grey mass, and even then there was something about its appearance that suggested it was not of this earth. Not merely in the sense of its origin, but in its very essence. The following day, 3 professors from Miskatonic University, men of letters and science, equipped with the tools of their trade, arrived at the Gardner farm to examine the celestial visitor. They found the meteorite had shrunk considerably since its impact, a phenomenon that defied the known laws of physics. As they chipped away at the surface, they discovered that the stone was not solid in the traditional sense. It was soft, almost malleable, and within it lay a small translucent globule of a colour that none of them could name. It was not a hue found within the terrestrial spectrum. It was something alien, a chromatic blasphemy that seemed to vibrate with a life of its own. When they attempted to test the globule with various acids and reagents, it remained stubbornly indifferent. Yet when they applied a blowpipe, the substance did not melt, but rather vanished, leaving behind no residue save for a faint, lingering sense of wrongness. As the weeks passed, the meteorite continued to shrink until it eventually disappeared into the soil, leaving only a hollow in the ground and a growing sense of unease in the hearts of the Gardner family. The scientists, baffled and unable to provide a rational explanation, returned to Arkham, leaving Nahum to his chores and his crops. At first, the effects of the meteorite's presence seemed almost miraculous. The harvest of that year was the most bountiful Nahum had ever seen. The pear trees groaned under the weight of fruit that was unnaturally large and possessed a lustre that was almost hypnotic. The apples were enormous, their skins stretched tight over flesh that seemed to pulse with a hidden vitality. However, the miracle soon revealed itself to be a curse. When the family sat down to eat the fruit of their labour, they found it to be utterly inedible. The pears, though beautiful to the eye, tasted of ash and gall, a bitter metallic tang that left a lingering foulness in the mouth. The apples were worse, their interiors filled with a grey mephitic rot that seemed to have been present from the moment of their inception. The entire harvest, the pride of the Gardner farm, was a hollow mockery of sustenance. It was as if the very life force of the earth had been subverted, twisted into something that mimicked the forms of nature, while harbouring an essence that was profoundly inimical to human life. As autumn turned to winter, the changes in the environment became more pronounced and more terrifying. The snow that fell upon the Gardner farm did not look like the snow that fell elsewhere. It seemed to melt more quickly in some places and not at all in others. And where it did melt, it revealed a ground that was beginning to turn a sickly ashen grey. The tracks of animals in the snow were also wrong. Nahum noticed that the footprints of the local rabbits and squirrels were distorted, the gait of the creatures suggesting a skeletal structure that had become fluid and unstable. Even the family dog, a loyal and sturdy animal, began to exhibit a strange lethargy, its eyes reflecting a light that was not a reflection of any lamp or hearth fire. The atmosphere of the farmstead became heavy with a sense of impending doom. The trees, though stripped of their leaves by the winter frost, did not look dead. They looked expectant. Their branches clawed at the grey sky with a frantic energy, and Ammi Pierce, visiting his friend Nahum, noted that the woods seemed to be moving even when there was no wind to stir them. There was a subtle luminescence that began to emanate from the vegetation at night, a faint, flickering glow of that same unnameable colour that had been found within the meteorite. It was a light that did not illuminate so much as it emphasized the surrounding darkness, a phosphorescence of decay that seemed to be drawing the very vitality out of the air. The first of the Gardner family to succumb to the creeping horror was Nabby. Her descent into madness was not sudden, but rather a slow erosion of the mind. She began to speak of the colour, claiming that she could see it moving in the air, dancing in the shadows of the corners and seeping out of the walls. She described it as a thing that had no shape, yet possessed a terrible weight, a presence that was both everywhere and nowhere. Her eyes, once bright with the cares of a farm wife, became glassy and distant, reflecting a world that no one else could see. She would stand for hours by the window, staring out at the well, her lips moving in a silent dialogue with the void. Nahum, a man of simple faith and stubborn resolve, tried to care for her as best he could, but the Nabby he knew was gone. In her place was a creature of whimpers and screams, a woman who had become a stranger to her own flesh. Eventually, for her own safety and the safety of the boys, Nahum was forced to lock her in the attic. It was a decision that tore at his soul, but the farm required his attention, and the boys were becoming increasingly frightened by their mother's erratic behaviour. Yet even behind the locked door, Nabby's presence was felt. Her cries would echo through the house at night, mingling with the sighing of the wind and the unnatural creaking of the trees, creating a symphony of despair that settled over the Gardner home like a shroud. Then came the spring of 1883, a season that should have brought rebirth, but instead brought only further dissolution. The vegetation that sprouted from the grey soil was a nightmare of botanical mutation. The grass was not green, but a pale, sickly hue that seemed to shimmer with a faint internal light. The flowers that bloomed were misshapen, their petals arranged in patterns that defied the symmetry of nature, and their scent was not the fragrance of blossoms, but a cloying, sweetish odour of putrefaction. The insects that buzzed through the air were similarly transformed. The bees were bloated and sluggish, their hum a low, discordant thrumming that vibrated in the bones of those who heard it. The livestock fared no better. The cows produced milk that was thin and grey, a liquid that no one dared to drink. The pigs became monstrous, their flesh sagging in folds that seemed to move independently of their muscles, and their squeals took on a human-like quality that chilled the blood. One by one the animals began to die, their bodies crumbling into a fine grey powder within hours of their passing. It was as if the very substance of their being had been consumed from within, leaving behind only the dry, brittle husks of their former selves. It was during this time that Thaddeus, the eldest son, began to show signs of the same mental decay that had claimed his mother. He had been a boy of great strength and promise, but the constant exposure to the colour and the mounting horrors of the farm broke him. He returned from the well one afternoon, his eyes wide with a terror that surpassed speech. He could only point toward the water and babble incoherently about the things that lived in the depths. Like his mother, he was eventually confined to a room, his mind a shattered remnant of what it had once been. The isolation of the Gardner family was now complete. The neighbours, led by a primal instinct for self-preservation, ceased to visit. Only Ammi Pierce remained a steadfast friend, though even he found it increasingly difficult to cross the threshold of that accursed place. He saw the way the trees moved in the night, their limbs twitching with a rhythmic pulsating motion that suggested they were being manipulated by unseen strings. He saw the way the light from the well would rise up in the darkness, a column of alien fire that reached toward the stars from which it had fallen. The tragedy deepened with the disappearance of the younger boys. Merwin, a child of sensitive temperament, was the first to go. He had been sent to the well to fetch water, a task that had become fraught with dread, and he simply never returned. Nahum and Ammi searched the grounds for days, their lanterns casting long, distorted shadows against the grey dust, but they found no trace of him. There were no tracks, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the boy had been erased from existence. Shortly thereafter, Zenas, the youngest, also vanished. He had been playing near the barn, and in the space of a heartbeat he was gone. The silence that followed their disappearances was more profound than any scream, a heavy, suffocating quiet that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. By the time the final act of the drama unfolded, Nahum Gardner was a man transformed. His hair had turned white, his skin was the colour of the ashen soil, and his movements were slow and halting, as if his very bones had become brittle. He lived in a house of ghosts, the cries of his wife and eldest son, the only sounds that broke the monotony of his existence. He no longer farmed. There was nothing left to farm. The land was a wasteland of grey dust and pulsating shadows, a place where the laws of nature had been discarded in favour of a cosmic law that was beyond human comprehension. Ammi Pierce, driven by a sense of duty and a lingering affection for his friend, made one last visit to the Gardner farm in the autumn of 1883. What he found there was a vision of hell. The house was in a state of advanced decay, the wood of the walls crumbling at a touch. Inside, the air was thick with the cloying scent of the colour, and the shadows seemed to possess a physical presence. He found Nahum in the kitchen, slumped in a chair, his eyes fixed on the floor. Nahum was barely recognizable. His flesh seemed to be melting, his features blurring into a mask of grey despair. In a voice that was little more than a dry rasp, Nahum told Ammi of the final horrors. He spoke of how the colour had come out of the well and taken his boys, how it had fed on their life force until there was nothing left but the grey dust. He spoke of Nabby and Thaddeus, and how the thing in the attic was no longer his wife or his son, but something else, a vessel for the alien essence that was consuming the world. He told Ammi that the colour was not just a light, but a hunger, a cold, insatiable hunger that had come from the dark places between the stars to feast upon the vitality of the earth. Driven by a grim necessity, Ammi ascended the stairs to the attic. The air grew colder with every step, and the light of his lantern seemed to dim as he approached the door where Nabby and Thaddeus were confined. When he opened the door, he was met with a sight that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. There were no people in that room. There were only two heaps of grey, pulsating matter that bore a sickening resemblance to human forms. They were translucent, their interiors glowing with that same blasphemous colour, and as Ammi watched, they seemed to shift and flow, their very substance being drawn toward the window and the well beyond. Ammi fled the house, his mind reeling from the horror of what he had witnessed. He found Nahum still in the kitchen, but the man was now past all help. Nahum's final words were a plea for Ammi to leave, to get away before the colour took him as well. As Ammi stumbled out into the night, he saw the well begin to glow with a terrifying intensity. A pillar of light, a vertical shaft of that unnameable hue, erupted from the depths of the earth, shooting upward into the blackness of the sky. It was a spectacle of cosmic power, a silent, roaring ascent that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. From his vantage point on the road, Ammi watched as the colour departed. It did not all go at once. A small portion of the light seemed to break off and fall back into the well, a lingering spark of the alien fire that would remain to poison the land for generations to come. The rest of the light vanished into the void, returning to the Stygian depths from which it had emerged. The Gardner farm was left in total darkness, a place of silence and ash, the life having been utterly drained from it by the celestial parasite. In the days that followed, the authorities from Arkham were summoned and a search of the farm was conducted. They found the remains of Nahum Gardner in the kitchen, a pile of grey dust that crumbled when touched. In the attic they found similar remains, the last vestiges of Nabby and Thaddeus. The well was explored, and at the bottom they found the bones of the two younger boys, along with the skeletal remains of the livestock. The water in the well was found to be tainted with a substance that defied analysis, a liquid that was neither water nor oil, but something that shimmered with a faint internal light. The scientists from Miskatonic returned, but they could offer no explanations. They took samples of the soil, the dust and the water, but their instruments could find no familiar elements. The blasted heath became a place of legend, a forbidden zone where no one dared to tread. The trees continued to grow in their distorted patterns, their branches reaching for a sky that had once birthed a monster. The grey dust remained, a testament to the fact that something from beyond the stars had touched the earth and found it wanting. Years passed, and the memory of the Gardner family faded into the realm of ghost stories and local folklore. The surveyor, listening to Ammi Pierce's tale, felt a chill that the New England autumn could not account for. He looked out over the valley, at the place where the reservoir would soon be, and he wondered what lay beneath the surface of the water. Ammi, now an old man lost in the shadows of his own mind, warned him that the colour was still there, lurking in the depths of the well, waiting for the day when it would feed again. The surveyor finished his work and left the valley, but the image of the blasted heath stayed with him. He thought of the vastness of the universe, of the cold, indifferent stars, and the things that might dwell in the darkness between them. He thought of the Gardner family, simple people who had been destroyed by a force they could not understand, their lives snuffed out like candles in a gale. And he knew, with a certainty that defied reason, that the earth was not the master of its own destiny, that we are but motes of dust in a cosmic drama, subject to the whims of entities whose very existence is a challenge to our sanity. The reservoir was eventually completed, and the valley was flooded, burying the Gardner farm and the blasted heath beneath millions of gallons of water. The locals say that the water in that part of the lake is never quite still, and that on certain nights when the moon is thin and the stars are bright, a faint, unnatural glow can be seen rising from the depths. They say that the fish in that area are misshapen and bitter to the taste, and that no bird will ever fly over the centre of the lake. The colour remains a hidden legacy of the meteorite, a silent, pulsating reminder that the universe is far older and far more terrifying than we dare to imagine. In the end, the story of the colour out of space is a story of the limits of human knowledge. We build our houses and plant our crops, believing ourselves to be the masters of our environment, but we are merely tenants on a world that is subject to the intrusions of the infinite. The Gardners were not victims of malice. They were victims of an encounter with the truly alien, a thing so far removed from our understanding that its very presence was a lethal contagion. The blasted heath may be underwater, but the shadow it cast remains, a grey, powdery stain on the soul of the New England hills, a warning to all who would look too closely at the stars and wonder what lies beyond the veil of the known. The surveyor never returned to Arkham. He moved back to the city, to the lights and the noise and the comforting bustle of human civilization. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, he would find himself staring at the sky, searching for a hint of that unnameable colour among the constellations. And in those moments he would feel the same cold dread that had gripped Ammi Pierce, the realization that we are never truly safe, and that the universe is filled with horrors that have no name, no shape, and no mercy. The colour is out there, somewhere in the vast, Stygian depths, and one day it may return to finish what it began in the lonely hills west of Arkham.